everyone, and welcome to today's presentation of the International Criminal Law Committee. Today's program is the second part of our two-part session on mass graves. Our first session is available on our website for streaming. Today's session is titled Dignity of the Dead, Part 2, Legal and Forensic Technical Perspectives on Mass Graves. We have three speakers with us today. I'll just briefly introduce them. By the way, I'm Timothy Franklin. I'm the co-chair of the International Criminal Law Committee, and I'll be moderating today. And these are our speakers. We have Dr. Melanie Klinkner is an international law scholar, and together with Dr. Ellie Smith, she's the author of the Bournemouth Protocol on Mass Grave Protection and Investigation. Since October 2023, she's working on a 5-year-long, £1.6 million project to develop a comprehensive human rights framework for mass grave protection, investigation, and engagement. MAGPIE. She led an Arts and Humanities Research Council Research Leaders Fellowship for the creation of mass grave protection guidelines with the International Commission on Missing Persons, the ICMP, as project partner. And thank you, there's the link to the protocol there in the chat for everyone. She was the project manager for the ICMP. In addition, she was the principal investigator on a Global Challenges Research Fund project on how to humanize the process of mass graves protection and investigation from the representative perspective of victims' families. She also led a Leverhulme-funded project to explore the merit of open source mass grave mapping. Together with Dr. Howard Davis, she is the author of the monograph, The Right to the Truth in International Law, published by Routledge in 2020. And during Trinity Term 2018, she was a research visitor at Oxford University's Bornavoro Institute of Human Rights. She's a fellow of the Academy of Social Science, and since February 2021, a member of the panel of experts on missing persons for the ICMP. At Bournemouth University, she teaches public international law, international criminal law, and international human rights law. Sarah Nucky joined Columbia Law School in July 2014 as faculty co-director of the Human Rights Institute, director of the Human Rights Clinic, and the Leif Cabrasier, Clinic of the Leif Cabrasier Clinical Professor of Law. Nucky is an international human rights lawyer, professor, and special advisor to the UN Special Rapporteur on extrajudicial executions. She has carried out fact-finding investigations and reported on human rights and armed conflict violations around the world, including in Afghanistan, Brazil, the Central African Republic, Colombia, the Democratic Republic of the Congo, Kenya, Papua New Guinea, and the United States. Her research and advocacy focus on issues such as unlawful killings, sexual violence, and corporate accountability. Nucky is a founding editor of Just Security, and an online forum for analysis of U.S. national security, law, and policy. She's been awarded the Fulbright Postgraduate Award, the Murphy Postgraduate Scholarship, the Harvard Human Rights Program Fellowship, the Parsons Memorial Prize for Law, and the KCF Keel Prize in Law. And Katelyn Bolhofner is an assistant professor of forensic anthropology in the School of Interdisciplinary Forensics and director of the Forensic Anthropology and Bioarchaeology Laboratories, the FAABL ASU. Dr. Bolhofner is a diplomat of the American Board of Forensic Anthropology. Her research in forensic anthropology and bioarchaeology links skeletal biology to issues of social identity, health, and human interactions in historical and archaeological contexts, as well as in contemporary society. Currently, she is the PI of an NIJ-funded multi-year, multi-agency interdisciplinary project seeking to employ skeletal trauma analysis to improve diagnostic criteria that will address and curb the rising trend of physical elder abuse. Dr. Bolhofner's work has been published in leading journals, presented nationally and internationally at major conferences, and is funded by multiple grants from the National Institute of Justice, the National Science Foundation, and the Wenner-Gren Foundation. So that is, those are our speakers. I'm going to just let each of you speak in order. We'll start with Melanie. Why don't you take it away?
Thank you so much. Greetings from the United Kingdom. Thank you for the invitation to contribute to this webinar. Thank you for organizing it, and thank you for your interest in the subject. In this presentation, I will outline the findings of collaborative research into mass graves and the legal framework that governs it, and the protection and investigation standards that follow. Mass graves, that's no secret, contain evidence that is absolutely essential to the effective realization of truth, justice, and accountability goals at multiple levels for families, for affected communities, states in transition, but also for the international community. As such, due to their significance, protection is largely undisputed. The question is more, how can and should mass graves be protected, and what international legal provisions safeguard protection and investigation? And that was the challenge that motivated the creation of the Bournemouth Protocol, the subject of my contribution today. And to that effect, I have put something in the chat, and I can now hopefully share the Bournemouth Protocol also on your screens here, the cover. But you can also follow the link and just click through it in your own time as best works for you. The Bournemouth Protocol is an instrument that brings together and reflects on the multidisciplinary engagement that mass graves require. And it was produced by bringing together multidisciplinary experts on the subject and to debate and agree shared principled approaches to it. So it offers a cohesive and universal set of rules, procedures, and standards that relate to the full life cycle of the mass graves for all actors that are engaged by the processes. And it indicates the really complex interactions and the context specificities and the resources that can be needed in order to conduct an effective investigation. But also at the same time, always trying to inform the decision makers prior to actually initiating an investigation. In that sense, it builds on the Minnesota protocol without duplicating it. And that's important because Sarah Nucky will speak, I think, to the Minnesota protocol a little bit later on. But it also really connects to the practitioner. And that's why it's so fantastic to have Katelyn here as well, to speak to that side of the matter. I said the need for protection is undisputed, but why is protection so essential for truth and justice? Well, the families of the victims have often an overwhelming need to know the fate of their loved ones, where they are, and to receive the mortal remains for burial and dignified commemoration. And the protection of mass grave sites is essential for them in that sense. But the evidential content makes mass graves vulnerable to disturbance, destruction, or relocation, where abusive states and/or perpetrators have decided that they would like to evade responsibility and scrutiny for their very action. And this, in turn, not only renders the work of the investigators and forensic staff complicated, but it crucially causes further distress to families of the victims. So how does the Bournemouth Protocol approach this subject? Well, first up, each section is rooted in international law. The protocol itself is firmly anchored in international legal provisions, combining international human rights law, international humanitarian law, and where applicable, international criminal law. And in doing so, it really tries to provide this robust legal rationale for mass grave protection and appropriate excavations, exhumations that follow. And this is significant for victims, families, and survivors. They may care very little what branch of international law applies. It's important that their rights are met. And therefore, the Bournemouth Protocol also offers a definition for a mass grave, because we haven't got one in international law. I'm trying to click into and zoom into briefly so that you can actually see. A mass grave in our definition denotes a site or defined area containing a multitude of buried, submerged, or surface scattered human remains, where the circumstances surrounding the death and or the body disposal method do warrant an investigation as to the lawfulness of what has happened. And when discovering a mass grave, in contradistinction to a mass burial, questions of legality arise. Did the person die a suspicious death, and or was the way in which those bodies were disposed of lawful? As lawyers, we all know that international legal provisions enshrine rights such as the right to life, or the right not to be subjected to torture or degrading treatment, to safeguard and protect from unlawful killings. And codification can be found in the Convention Against Torture and Other Cruel, Inhuman, and Degrading Treatment, or the International Convention for the Protection of Persons from Enforced Disappearance, which defines enforced disappearance. But also, I would like to point to the Rome Statute, for that criminalizes enforced disappearance as a form of crime against humanity. And of course, we cannot forget during armed conflict, international humanitarian law, the Geneva Conventions and the protocols govern the legitimate conduct of warring fractions, including efforts to ensure that people do not go missing and are instead accounted for. So we are very, very keen to connect the law with the chronological stages of mass graves investigations. And for this, I'm just going to zoom into parts of our appendix. So we really try to reflect the complex nature of mass graves and the careful coordination and multiple needs of stakeholders that we wanted to follow. So firstly, discovery of the site and the availability of safe reporting procedures. That was really important. Site access can be challenging, so we need to mitigate against those issues. Then arise for the protection of the site, both physically but also digitally, and the investigation of the site itself, including the overall and operational responsibility, really have to be thought through. What team composition do you need? What liaison channels with families and the media, the forensic identification side of human remains, the collection and use of evidence from the mass graves at the trial, the return of those human remains, how this then gets communicated again to the family members justice mechanisms for family, and then also commemoration and memorialization that may come at the mass grave site or at a reburial site. So all of these things need to be thought through, and so a lot goes into the planning phase. And at the heart of the protection measures are states as the main guarantor of the duty and the duty bearer of the obligation to protect, and in case of breaches, investigate, search, and identify. So what rights and obligation may be engaged at each stage? Well, the investigative duty of a state to carry out an independent, thorough, and impartial investigation is absolutely crucial, and I believe Sarah will talk to that a little bit more. But it is an obligation of means and not of results. So there's always a little caveat there. But there are other international norms that also contain requirements designed to cater for example, the needs in relation to human remains so that they are returned. So I mentioned the International Convention on Enforced Disappearance, on protection of all persons from enforced disappearance. So there we really see that identification efforts should form part of the investigation process, that identity can actually be ascertained, and receiving an authoritative account of what happened can also assist in other pursuits of justice, but can also be perceived as a remedy. And for this, we really wanted to capture that compensation, restitution, rehabilitation, and satisfaction really can sort of come together there as well, and are very important to mass graves, but also guarantees of non-repetition, as enshrined in the basic principles and guidelines on the right to a remedy and reparation for victims of gross human rights violations and humanitarian law violations. Of note, I think, are also the retributive justice efforts that have come before international criminal institutions in relation to mass graves. To that, I point to the former Yugoslavia and the cases of Mladic and Karadzic, where mass grave investigation provided evidence to confirm the perpetration of really truly heinous crimes, including the crime of genocide, of torture, and enforced disappearance, but also generally grave breaches of the Geneva Convention, as are all codified by treaty. Finally, it's worth noting that following an investigation, both the original mass grave and any potential new burial and commemoration site may be deserving of protection, as they may come under the ambit of the right to private and family life. The right to freedom of thought, conscience, and religion is relevant, since the manner of burying the dead can form an essential aspect of religious practice as protected under freedom of thought, conscience, and religion. And with it, an excavated mass grave may become a memorial site in its own right, that then in turn may require long-term legal protection. And crucially, each section of the Bournemouth Protocol leads with the legal norms in a blue little box, explaining the different steps that actors and considerations need to be taken in order to help foster really lawful engagement with mass graves and sensitive engagement with mass graves. And through this approach, each aspect of mass graves, from the discovery to the commemoration and the final resting places, is situated in that bigger picture of multiply, but also potentially divergent victims' needs and the legal considerations and practical challenges that come with it. So to date, we have 15 translated versions of the Bournemouth Protocol, because sadly, mass graves are a global phenomenon. And this leads me to my final point. The work that we're presenting here, and I'm presenting here today, is a living document, so it needs to be kept under review, much like the Minnesota Protocol has also undergone reviews. So Gaza, Ukraine, Syria, Yemen, Sudan, and Iraq, they all present present-day mass grave hotspots, and often a consequence of armed conflict. But the legacy of mass graves is felt decades after their creation, and there are many more lessons we need to learn, and there are really many more areas that may qualify as mass graves, which currently remain unnoticed. And so it's important that the dignity of those dead gets also fully considered, to really try and mitigate the pain and the injury of the living ultimately. And this is what motivates our current research project that Tim, you alluded to at the beginning, in your kind introduction, called Magpie, which I'm just sharing the screen here with our website. And for 4 years, we will try to look at filling any gaps that we know exist in the framework. And crucially, we have the ability also to revisit the Bournemouth Protocol in light of continued and new learning. Thank you. I'll share a link to the website as well in the chat, if I may. I'll stop sharing screen.
Thank you. Thanks very much. We have on our committee website, we have links to all of these, to Magpie and all of these things as well, for people that that miss this, that don't get miss the chat. So just if you don't get it here, just go to our website, and it's under Melanie's, her speaker. Her description has all the things hyperlinked. So we're going to, and that applies to the other speakers as well. So thanks very much for that. That was excellent. We're going to go to Katelyn now. Katelyn?
Thank you, Tim. I'm going to go ahead and try to share my screen. See if it works. Are we seeing? I think I need to switch it real quick. 1 second. Sorry about that. How about that?
You're good.
Okay, great. Thank you, Tim, and thank you as well, Regina, for the initial invitation to present today. I think I'm a little bit of an outlier. We were joking sort of in the Zoom backstage about this, but I hope I can cover some points that are of interest to your group. I'm going to specifically today be discussing on-the-ground approaches from a very specific perspective as a forensic anthropologist, thinking about locating, mapping, excavating, and ultimately identifying the victims in mass graves. And these are going to be specific to a project that I'm conducting in Paraguay, looking at victims of Operation Condor there. So just a quick note, the following presentation does contain images of human remains. They're not identifiable. And of course, they were chosen very carefully for their educational value. But I like to put that caveat at the start. So in the United States medical legal system, forensic anthropologists, and specifically board-certified forensic anthropologists such as myself, are using the application of skeletal analysis in a context where they are aiding the medical examiner or coroner in a very specific purpose, right? Death certification, where you need a positive scientific ID and some notion of the cause and manner of death in order to issue a death certificate. And this is important to think about as you think about involving forensic anthropologists in your work, because typically we are involved, at least in the US medical legal system, at the scene recovery and body recovery, so trained in those excavation techniques and mapping, and also at autopsy, and our report ultimately aids in that certification of cause and manner of death and the personal identification of those individuals. So if we abstract out and we're thinking about domestic and international medical legal systems and some of the challenges that come with approaching mass disaster situations, we still have those same goals in mind as practitioners. We need to personally identify those individuals, right, for the victims' families in particular. And sometimes the extent to which that's possible or practical varies according to the situation. So in the planning stages, we need to ask ourselves what kind of resources are available on the ground and whether or not we realistically have ante-mortem information that we might need to make those IDs. And so sometimes we're going to be relying upon presumptive identifications. That certification of death piece is usually a little bit more straightforward and is required in different ways in different countries. So there may not be a formal tracking system for social identity that needs to be in place. There may not be the need for the issuance of a certificate of death, but in cases where there are, this can be straightforward, but not always, right? It's that question of arguing over how those remains came to be there. When we focus in on mass graves, as Melanie noted, there's really no current minimum number of individuals or current sort of definition of a mass grave. And what's more and more complicated, as Melanie said, is they can be orderly, they can be erratic, scattered. And so that the fact that there's no pattern to be expected, there's no sort of definition of what we're looking for or what we will be finding, can lead to some of these major challenges on the ground with locating and excavating, scientifically mapping those graves, and then analyzing and identifying the victims. So I'm going to, and I know I'm racing through this, 10 minutes is a tall challenge for covering some of this, but I'm going to try to take on each of these challenges from the perspective of our project in Paraguay to try to get away from some of the academic education piece of it and into some of the logistical challenges that we faced, because it's very likely that these are slightly different, but definitely the same in most places when we're thinking about these major on-the-ground approaches to mass graves. Our project is entitled They Are Our Parents, and is coming from the notion that most of the Paraguayan team that I work with, they are directly searching for that level of loved ones, right? Their family, their parents, their brothers and sisters. They're very much in the process of trying to locate those mass grave sites, get those mapped, get permission to excavate, and then ultimately trying to find their family. Some context for what's happened in Paraguay. In the 50s, we had a coup d'etat in Paraguay where we have a dictator essentially rule for 35 years, zero tolerance for opposition, and this was exacerbated by the implementation of what's known as Operation Condor, which was really a campaign of political repression fueled by international intelligence operations, particularly we now know by the United States as well. And it was formally implemented in the 70s by dictatorships in the southern cone of South America, which you see here, some of those dates when it was implemented. Paraguay is smack in the middle. We know minimally that 60,000 individuals across the southern cone and 400,000 were killed and 400,000 more were imprisoned at this time. Again, these are a variety of individuals, enemies of the state, and mostly accused of being left-wing or communist sympathizers. We've seen a lot of success with justice marching forward in Argentina and Chile and Uruguay in particular in the past few decades. Paraguay has been a little bit slower, not for lack of effort or information, mainly for lack of finances and expertise. In Paraguay, the Archive of Terror was uncovered in 1992, and this archive is actually an amazing record of the activities carried out by the Paraguayan secret police during this time. So the records are there. In addition, as I said, many of the family members and witnesses are providing these locations and accounts themselves. There are an estimated 423 disappeared Paraguayans that we are looking for, thought to be deposited in mass graves. This is known to be an underestimate, right? But this is our most conservative estimate based on these archives. We know that we are missing many more individuals. And as of 2019, only 37 bodies have been recovered from that 423, and only 4 have been positively identified. So if we think about some of the challenges in this context, and we're looking specifically at locating those graves, which are usually illicit. In Paraguay, they're now in the jungle, or they are behind police precincts, or they're in farms, or they are privately located. So we may know where they are, but then the challenge of excavating and mapping comes into play when you're thinking about local permissions. And in our case, the quick expiration of those permissions prior to being able to organize that excavation. And then some of the challenges with analysis and identification are also pretty unique there. As I said, the challenges in Paraguay are not without many years of effort. The Historical Memory Department of the Ministry of Justice, they have been working tirelessly to identify through witness accounts sites that are potentially mass grave sites. They've identified more than 30. You can see in this map, those little red circles are where they have tentatively decided that they think based on witness accounts they should be searching further. The sites had not been scientifically mapped or surveyed in any way prior to 2023. There were a few instances of local ground penetrating radar being used, but not very successfully. The permission for exploration of these sites, as I said, varies pretty widely. And you not only need that permission locally by the land ownership, but also permission of the local ADA in Paraguay to do anything, really. In 2024, the team from ASU mapped 7 of these sites, and this includes GIS mapping, drone photography, GPR, and then we're going to return in January of 2025 to continue sort of this systematic mapping of these sites prior to any application for excavation. When it comes to excavation, we know that we are going to be facing a challenge. This is a picture of our most promising site. And as you can see, the building around it is collapsing. They built a huge structure over it. The concrete there is dipping. And we've needed multiple rounds of approval. And the logistics there are very complex, things to think about as you go in, arranging for funding, machinery, your local workers, security for the site, as Melanie said. You'll need to house the people you bring in and those who work there, equipment and supplies, and all in a very limited window of time. So my plug would be to set this up as a formal archaeological excavation with that anthropological input from the beginning, or I would suggest that evidence is going to be missed because you can't sort of unring that bell once you begin excavating. When we think about then identifying those victims who we've excavated, the forensic anthropologists on the ground or who you bring in will be able to give you sort of this preliminary statistics of the biological profile. Right, so these are characteristics that are not in themselves individualizing, but give you a sense for the range, the distribution of the population in that grave site. This is complicated in mass graves by commingling, which is just the mixing of the body parts or skeletal elements from 2 or more individuals. And the questions are not only going to be how many individuals are present, but how can we possibly go about identifying single individuals in this scenario? There are a number of ways to go about unmingling commingled remains. I'm not going to belabor this point because I know I'm going to run out of time, but I just want to point this out to those of you who are organizing sort of these plans and approaches to mass grave excavation, that there are multiple ways of going about deciding how many individuals are present, especially if you're not sure initially or if it's not part of your goal to personally identify those individuals. It may be useful to you to not estimate a minimum number of individuals present, which estimates the recovered number of individuals, but to maybe think about and ask your collaborators about estimating the most likely number of individuals present, which is an estimate involved a little more calculation, but it gives you the original number of individuals present, or at least an estimate of that, rather than that minimum number. And again, this needs to be goal-driven and project-specific to know whether or not personal ID is possible, or if prosecution is angling towards prosecuting for the magnitude of the crime, in which case you may want the estimate of the original number of individuals represented by that assemblage. I get the question all the time, and I'm sure this is the question most forensic anthropologists get all the time. Well, we're just going to run DNA. Well, we're just going to do the DNA. Well, in cases of mass graves, this is not always as easy as it comes across. There are two ways that you could run the DNA, right? There's mitochondrial DNA and nuclear DNA. There are ever-changing approaches to identifying unidentified individuals, especially from degraded skeletal material. But something to keep in mind is this is not as easy as it sounds. If you have a mass grave where you're thinking that these are family groups, mitochondrial DNA won't be able to differentiate closely related individuals. And if you have a mass grave situation where you don't have sort of DNA from the individual you are looking for, or a living immediate family member where you can get a reference sample, you're going to have difficulty identifying that person, even if you're able to get DNA from their remains, which can be difficult due to the level of decomposition or degradation of those samples. So DNA is not always the gold standard in cases of mass disaster identifications. I will say, this is my last slide, Tim, I promise, that even though we may not always be able to positively identify those individuals, a great start, and the start, I would argue, is the importance of establishing a family and survivor network in your location. Not only because those families and survivors have that motivation, often have access to witness accounts for the location of your sites and documenting the context, but also because if you have any hope of being able to personally identify those individuals you excavate, you can and should get a jump on building a missing persons database for your location, and a DNA database is also possible. So going in with buccal swabs, cheek swabs to collect the DNA of those family members, so that when and if you're able to excavate, you're able to almost immediately try to make those connections and try to make those IDs with the living family's buccal swabs. I will wrap up by saying if you have any questions, please feel free to email me. I know that was a whirlwind and I went over time. The QR code on the screen will take you to our website where you can get updates for the project ongoing in Paraguay. But thank you so much for your attention today. I appreciate the invitation.
Thank you very much. And I'm sorry we didn't have more time, because I thought that was fascinating. And I tried to link to some of your work on our website too, which I encourage everyone to check out, because it's very interesting, and not strictly from this particular discipline, but just it's very it's from just the elder review stuff was also just very interesting too.
Thank you.
All right. So our last speaker is Sarah Nucky, Professor Sarah Nucky, Dr. Professor Sarah Nucky, and please, without any further ado, let's turn the microphone to her. Thank you.
Thanks, Tim. Katelyn, Melanie, we've never been on a panel before, and it was so wonderful to learn from both of you. I hope that this final presentation for the audience complements, it'll overlap in some parts, but I hope it complements the expertise that you both shared already. So what I'd like to speak on today is first, the international law related to the state duty to investigate. Second, the human rights at stake in mass grave investigations, particularly the rights of family members, and the importance overall of a human rights-based approach to investigating mass graves. And third, if there's time, some of the implications of these rights for key components or elements of the investigation process. This outline draws on my work as part of a group that revised the Minnesota Protocol on the investigation of unlawful death that Melanie referred to, as well as prior work advising the UN Special Rapporteur on extrajudicial executions. Doing work also as an independent expert to various courts tasked with conducting war crimes investigations involving mass graves. Those were multidisciplinary investigations with the forensic anthropology team from Argentina, focused there mostly in the Central African Republic, and then work with families and communities in a lot of different countries impacted by unlawful killings. So first, I thought it might help to outline some of the common kinds of facts and circumstances. For example, in some of the cases I've worked on, family members may suspect, but not be entirely or at all sure if their family members were killed or are in a particular grave site. They may be in a state of significant uncertainty and unable to grieve for not knowing what happened. There could have been attempts by perpetrators to hide evidence of their crimes or other disruption of a site, or even an initial exhumation, well-intentioned, but by non-experts. Bodies in a grave may be, as Katelyn discussed, highly commingled, buried in an extremely undignified manner without any respect for religious or cultural traditions. Perpetrators are often still free, potentially still active or in power, and there may or may not be any ongoing legal criminal investigation. There may or may not be even a possibility of such an investigation. So from some of those kind of facts that I've experienced in my own work, we can see that there can be multiple purposes to a mass grave investigation. First, what's often called the humanitarian purpose, generally framed as focused on the family members, where the exhumation, the identification can help families to uncover the fate of their loved ones, to grieve, to rebury with dignity. Second, often overlapping but not necessarily a legal purpose, to uncover legally admissible evidence, the physical evidence of unlawful killing for prosecution of perpetrators, and there can be a deterrence goal there as well. Sometimes there can be conflicts between the humanitarian and the legal goal, where one may be prioritized or pursued at the expense of the other. There also can be historical purposes, particularly with much older graves, documentation to set a historical record straight. And then purposes related to dignifying the dead, restoring their identity and enabling proper burial. So a human rights-based approach that we see used in many different sectors promotes rights fulfillment as a core goal of any work, and calls for the clear identification of rights and obligations, along with the rights holders and the duty bearers, and advancing principles through the work of participation, accountability, equality, and non-discrimination. So in the mass grave investigation context, some of the key state duties, Melanie touched on this already, they have a primary duty to investigate potentially unlawful deaths, ensure accountability, and remedy violations. A failure to respect that duty to investigate is itself a violation of the right to life. And that state duty to investigate is triggered not only when it's clear that there was an unlawful death, but when reasonable allegations are made. The state must also take action to investigate. And importantly, in this context, there are key elements, standards for what that investigation should look like. It should be prompt, it should be independent, transparent, and particularly importantly here, thorough. In this kind of a case, then, an investigation should be seeking to identify the victims, recover material related to the cause of death, determine manner of death, and determine who was involved in that death. If we switch over then to the human rights of the family members of those who were killed or suspected killed, there's a whole range of human rights that are important to be thinking through and conducting such an investigation. Some of the key ones are, first, the right to know the truth of what happened to their loved ones, to an accurate record of what happened, and to information about the violations if they did take place. The right to remedy includes the government obligation to verify the facts and public disclosure of the truth, and an accurate accounting of those violations. Family members have the rights to seek and obtain information, and in cases of a potentially unlawful death, they have the right at a minimum to information about the circumstances, the location, the condition of the remains, and the cause and manner of death when it's been determined. Second, families have the right for there to be a search for the disappeared or the bodies of those killed, and to have the remains of their loved ones returned back to them. They have quite specific rights in relation to human remains. When the identity of a deceased person has been determined, family members should be informed immediately. To the extent possible, they should also be consulted prior to an autopsy, for example. And once an investigation is complete, human remains should be returned to family members, allowing them to rebury or deal with those remains according to their beliefs. And relatedly, three, they have the right to bury their loved ones with dignity in accordance with their traditions. And those religious and cultural traditions also should be respected through the entire process of an investigation. And then fourth, the right to accountability for the wrong, to effective access to justice, sanctions against those responsible. And finally, five, to participate and have information about processes that affect them. So in this context, the participation of family members of a deceased or disappeared person is a really important element of an effective investigation. And the state should enable relatives to participate effectively in investigation processes. So the third then area I'd like to talk about in the last couple minutes is, what do these rights mean for specific aspects of a mass grave investigation? So thinking back to the purposes, the legal and humanitarian purposes, when there is an ongoing criminal investigation, a legal process related to a mass grave, seeking to gather evidence for criminal prosecution, it's also very important that those broader family rights and the humanitarian purposes are taken into account as well, and not kept as a more secondary priority. A human rights-based approach takes full account of all of the rights at stake for criminal accountability, as well as for identification and return of remains. We've seen in some criminal processes that they're designed to gather evidence for prosecution, of course, often looking for cause and manner of death. But in that context, it may be not as prioritized to identify each of the remains, to reassociate the full remains, and to return those to family members. And this can cause a lot of distress for families. So rather, all the rights for accountability as well as for truth for remains returned should be sought to be achieved together, and the various purposes, humanitarian and legal, synced together. And then thinking through some of the implications for various processes or points of an investigation, one key point is at the point of or in advance of an exhumation, that the impacted families are involved there where possible, to ensure that an exhumation is carried out in accordance with their cultural and religious traditions. In some contexts, I've worked closely with families who wanted an exhumation but were concerned about how the process might happen, and worked with them to hold ceremonies that they wanted before the forensic scientists conducted their investigation. In the stage of ante-mortem interviewing or DNA sampling where that happens, ensuring that that's done with the fully informed consent of the families, and that the way that data is stored and how it's used is transparent and clear and consented to by them. And then to the reassociation and identification and return, ensuring that the planning for an investigation takes that into account, that finances are sought for that where it's needed, that it's built into the process so that families can achieve those goals as well. And then on accountability, of course, criminal accountability is also important, even if there's a case where there's not foreseeable actual criminal investigation or prosecution in a court, but that evidence during an exhumation is preserved through that process rather than undermined in case of future potential criminal investigation. So that's my time here, and look forward to discussion with the other panelists and questions from the audience.
You had a couple of questions, I believe, that you wanted to ask to the group. Melanie?
No, apart from I wanted to say thank you so much for being on a panel with me. I will actually reach out to Katelyn, I think, because of course what's going on in Paraguay is massively interesting for us as a team when we're looking at trying to work towards a global map of mass graves so that we can actually quantify it and actually make the case for better protection where possible and make representations to the UN. Eventually, possibly, hopefully. So that's one thing that I think I'll definitely wish to reach out for, and it's fascinating to see how I think Paraguay is lagging behind Argentina and a lot of other Latin American countries, and how I think then that compares with the success rate. I think that's something that will be really important to probably underscore. To what extent does this delay mean that, you know, and maybe you've already got data to that effect. I think that would be very interesting for me to note. And then I think Sarah has just put the investigative duty and spell that out so beautifully, and just picking up on the cultural rights and maybe indigenous rights. I think there's a little bit more work to be done, and certainly something to drill deeper. And I think what both talks really emphasized is that it's misleading to come up with anything that, or to suggest that any victims have homogenous views on it. So sometimes you have also difficulty in reconciling within a victim group how best to conduct an investigation that is sensitive and culturally acceptable, because the meanings can be quite disparate. And I think that's something that I think we will see more and more when we're looking at migration and mass graves that may result as a result from migration. So those are just a few connection points where I'm just genuinely looking forward to picking up conversations with both these wonderful speakers at a later point. So, but maybe there's something on success rate in Paraguay that you can already say something about.
I want to echo what you said. I really appreciate this invitation, and I loved hearing from both of you. I think one of the most important things for me as an anthropologist is to recognize the limits of my own expertise, and to be very happy to have input from others who are studying these issues from different perspectives. And what you've both said about victims' rights and families, this is what we are running into, right? We went down there focused on looking for permissions and thinking about excavations and the logistics on the ground of mass graves. But really what we struck is this notion that what justice means is very different for different family members. What they're seeking is very different. And there are real or perceived fears, right, of the current administration and speaking out and witness accounts and all of these things. In terms of the progress that's been made in Paraguay, they have been aided significantly by the Argentinian team. But the Argentinian team, with their own government change in the last year, they've been stopped now from offering any aid. And a lot of their aid has been in search of missing Argentinians, and sort of that are across the border in and out of Paraguay. So all across that southern cone. So having a grassroots Paraguayan team that's focused on the Paraguayan sites and mapping those we're at the beginning process for sure with that.
What about as far as the indigenous side of things go? Have you encountered any do you have any other examples of indigenous issues involving? This is directed to Sarah, actually, with where that's an issue. I'm just thinking. Do you have any? Are there any cases that you can? Any current cases that come to mind?
Yeah, it's not an area that I work on specifically, but I think it's an area where there's very much heightened responsibility by government actors and quite specific rights for Indigenous peoples in relation to their remains, which might be quite historical, but nevertheless, the state has an obligation to treat them with respect and to return them. And actually, there's a recent report this year from the UN Special Rapporteur on extrajudicial executions that's focused on rights of people who were killed, dignity of the dead, and he's got some great language in there focused on different vulnerable or marginalized peoples, including Indigenous peoples, and discussing the law that relates particularly to cases where Indigenous peoples have been killed, or where there might be sites, whether more recent or much older, that contain their remains.
That's the current rapporteur has done this. Okay, that's something to look at. Thank you. Well, we are at the unfortunately we are at the top of the hour and we're out of time. This has been incredibly enlightening and sobering conversation. How else put it? But thank you, all three of you, given unique insights and have all three have helped shape, at least for me. I've given helped form an understanding that I wouldn't otherwise have, and I think everyone in the audience feels the same way. But I really I thank you all very much for your time and for your wisdom. Next, our next webinar is going to be a Meet the Scholars session with Jessica Stern, and we'll give you information about that. So until then, I want to thank you all, everyone, for attending, and thank you to our speakers. Be safe, everyone, and have a good rest of your day.